Thank you so much for joining us for P&P Live at Lunch. I'm Heidi Lewis from Politics and Prose Bookstore in Washington, D.C., and I'm coming to you live from my living room in Silver Spring, Maryland. I usually jump in by asking who's here for the first time, but I actually want to know today who is tuning in again, who is back for your second or third Live at Lunch event. Let us know in the comments. You should see the chat over off on the side of your screen. We're so delighted today to have Dr. Andrea Bonior with us, who is going to talk about her new book. You might know her from the Baggage Check advice column in the Washington Post, which she's penned for 15 years, or from the seed of the book she's here to discuss, the DETOX Your Thoughts challenge she created for BuzzFeed, which they touted as free therapy and had overwhelming response. And we're really excited to get a little bit of that free therapy today as she discusses the new book. I'll show you, DETOX Your Thoughts, Quit Negative Self-Talk for Good and Discover the Life You've Always Wanted. And you can see I've flagged up my copy because I had so many moments stuck out to me. And that's really what actually Andrea advises herself when you read the book. If something hits you, it's for a reason. So write it down, work through it. And the book is just great. It functions almost as a workbook because there are prompts throughout and practices and real instruction for taming our negative thoughts. Before I bring her up and introduce her, I want to just go over a few of the best practices for you so that you can get the most out of this event today. As I've already said, there's a chat function off on your screen. Oh my goodness, Kendall Jones, thank you so much. She's here for her third Live at Lunch event. I love it. That's awesome. So use the chat. Last week I hosted Rick Hansen, the neuropsychologist who was talking about his new book, Neurodharma. And in the comments, people shared some of their favorite places to do walking meditations in the chat. And it was just so great. It was like, oh, here we are in this real community sharing ideas and things that work for us. So please do that, deepen the experience in the chat. We're here today. And secondly, please ask a question of Dr. Andrea. You'll see the ask a question button down at the bottom of your screen. If not, kind of hover your cursor over it and it'll pull up. You can log your questions there. She's going to talk for about 35 minutes and then come back on screen. I'll come back on screen to lead a Q&A. So we're excited to take your questions. Oh, right. Technical issues. We may have some. Everyone's on the internet. Crowdcast can be a little glitchy. So if anything goes wonky with your screen or audio, just refresh your browser. And we found that using Chrome or Firefox works best. So if you're not using that browser, you might want to get back in that way and use that for this event. If all else fails, our events are recorded and you can watch it again through this Crowdcast link or later when it goes up on our YouTube page where we archive all of our Politics and Prose book events. And we are able to keep bringing you these events because of your support and because you buy books from us. And you'll see right down at the bottom, there is a green button that says buy DETOX Your Thoughts from Politics and Prose. That'll take you right to our website where you can buy the book. And we are so grateful for you for doing that and supporting us. And I know a lot of you also donated to get into this event today. And it's so wonderful. Our community keeps us afloat and we love you for it. So I'm going to bring up Dr. Andrea here to talk about her wonderful new book. And here we go.
Hi. Thanks
Hi.
so much. Thank you, Heidi.
You're welcome. Thank you so much. We're excited to hear from you. So I'm going to minimize myself and let you get started.
Thanks. Yeah, it's incredibly special for me to be here today. Well, not particularly in my house, but for me to be at this event today because Politics and Prose is a bookstore that has meant so much to me and that I know means so much to so many in the DC community. And I'm so glad that the community support has been there. I'm not surprised, but I'm so glad because I think in this particular time, it's so important for us to be supporting the types of places that make our community so worthwhile. So I'm thrilled to be here talking today. And it's a very interesting time, to say the least. And I think coming out with a book about anxiety in the middle of a pandemic, first of all, but now seeing other layers of anxiety, seeing unrest, seeing people reckoning with the fact that we've had systemic injustice pretty much since the start of our country. It's a time of turmoil. It's a time of upset. It's a time of distress being normal to some extent. So part of what I want to focus on today is thinking about how to embrace discomfort in a way that actually brings positive change, in a way that actually gains us insight. You know, a lot of the interviews I did at the beginning of this book launch really focused on finding our calm, because again, things had just been disrupted. People were under lockdown. The stress of the pandemic and the fears and the ripple effects economically, the health fears were so huge that my focus became, for a lot of folks, helping feel better, right? Helping minimize discomfort, helping get through the day and cope in a way that felt good and that eased distress and fear. So now I actually see a little bit of a shift. I see actually the need to no longer necessarily keep ourselves calm in the same way, but to use some of our discomfort as a teaching tool, to use some of our discomfort, our anger, our fear. You know, with the death of George Floyd, I think we're seeing illuminated a lot of issues that have been really just woven into our society for many years. When I was first falling in love with psychology as an undergraduate, I was a research assistant on the development of the implicit association task. It was then called the IAT, and it was the first sort of official test of implicit bias. So it helped conceptualize that idea of implicit bias. And we looked at race and ethnicity, and we looked at gender in the very beginning. And, you know, I was just an undergrad, and it was such a profoundly uncomfortable experience for me. And I took the test myself and I ran participants through the test, that I think about that discomfort now, all these years later, decades later, in fact. And I think about the fact that I'm glad that I didn't turn away. I'm glad that I didn't say, this is too much. I don't want to look at my own racial bias. I don't want to look at the fact that growing up as a white person has been different for me compared to my African-American roommate. I'm glad that I didn't turn away. And I'm glad that I wasn't focused only on finding calm. And so I've tried so hard to continue to learn in these years since. And yet I also know I still have a long way to go. And I think what is so inspiring right now about the discomfort that we're seeing is that people are realizing that discomfort can lead to positive change. That if we don't turn away, that if we don't choose just to not feel the distress, if we don't choose to avoid the distress, we can actually gain insight and we can choose to make positive changes. So I think, you know, the talk that we'll think about today and the themes that I'll focus on today are a little bit different than what I would have focused on 2 months ago, when it was just about, hey, we've got this common enemy of this pandemic. Let's just stay healthy and stay calm and cope. Right now, I feel like, hey, we've got this new kind of distress and we need to look at it and we need to explore it and we need to actually feel it and engage with it. So backing up, thinking about distress, thinking about negative thoughts, thinking about anxiety in general, I'll tell you a little bit about how I came to want to write about this. So I'm a licensed clinical psychologist by trade. I've been on the faculty of Georgetown teaching abnormal psychology for about 14 years. And so I was seeing something very interesting over the years. And I was seeing the fact that there were new types of ways of thinking about thoughts, and they were in the research, and they were what I was teaching, and they were tools that I was using with my clients. And yet I really wasn't seeing them reflected in the typical self-help fare. And that's not to knock this typical self-help fare. I think in some ways it's helpful for a lot of people to, for instance, be told, you know, here's how to focus on the positive. Here's how to increase your optimism. But I think at times we really take that too far. Think happy thoughts, look on the bright side. And what I was seeing is that, of course, those traditional ways of dealing with negative thoughts, when the negative thoughts are truly a burden and a problem on a daily basis, those traditional cheerleading, come on, think positive, those techniques they really don't help. And the other thing that I was really seeing that I was struck by is that even old school cognitive behavioral therapy techniques, so old school CBT, and this is part of what I was trained in, it focused on challenging your negative thoughts. Let's reframe them. Let's be sort of the defense attorney and ask yourself if it's true. And let's sort of go to battle with these thoughts and not let them get away with anything and fight them. Right. And I think, again, I believe in those techniques in a lot of cases, and I've seen a lot of folks helped by those techniques. But again, on the other hand, there's a subset of people who are battling their thoughts all the time and they're not winning. The thoughts are coming back so frequently and so intensely. And I've worked with so many clients who say, I know this thought isn't true. I know I'm not a total failure. I know I'm not going to get fired tomorrow. And yet I have this thought anyway, and it bothers me anyway, and it takes up space. And I spend my days fighting it, but the thoughts just keep coming back. And we really start the book with a story of, Maggie, that's a pseudonym, of course, and how she had this constant negative battle with her work anxiety, and yet talking herself out of it and understanding that those thoughts weren't true, it didn't really help her. And so I should preface now, whenever there's a case study in the book, or I mention one today, it's really important for me to just emphasize that I have taken every detail that could possibly be the least bit identifying and really sort of had fun with it in a fictional way. So although the theme of the clinical basis of the stories is true, I just want you to know that there's never any story in the book that could be remotely connected to anyone that I had seen in therapy. And I feel incredibly privileged to be able to share these stories with my clients' permission. But again, they were so disguised so as to be virtually unrecognizable, even to a loved one or something like that. Anyway, so Maggie's work worries, she was in this constant battle. I'm a perfectionist. I'm stressed about work. I'm not going to do good enough job. I feel terrible about myself. And yes, I can try to talk myself out of it, but that's all I've ever been doing. How can I get these thoughts to go away? And the magic answer actually is to an entirely different question. It's not about getting the thoughts to go away. It's about learning to relate to them very differently. And that is what the new science is showing us. There's a relatively new field called acceptance and commitment therapy that really borrows a lot from CBT, but also represents a departure in certain ways. And the co-founder of that therapy, Stephen Hayes, I was lucky enough to have as a reviewer and endorser of my book. And the key is this. The key is that it's not about battling your thoughts anymore. It's about disempowering your negative thoughts by learning to step away from them. Because when you get into a battle with your thoughts, they just keep coming back. If I tell you right now, do not picture an elephant in a bikini, right? A lot of you, especially those of you that have a mind's eye and can picture things in your mind, you're seeing that elephant in your bikini. Like, this is the way that our brain works. When we try to avoid something, we first visualize it so that we know what we're up against. I need to recognize that thing I'm supposed to avoid. Well, lo and behold, thoughts are the same way. Don't have this negative thought. Don't have this negative thought. Well, there's the negative thought. So the first premise of this, that's really a game changer for a lot of folks, and I've been so privileged over the years to see it help people in the therapy room, is a concept of self-distancing, of being able to start viewing your thoughts as a gentle observer, as being somebody who's curious about your thoughts, but you're non-judgmental. You're not actually assuming that the thoughts are true, and you're not actually viewing the thoughts as part of yourself. I think in American culture especially, you are what you think, right? Think positive thoughts, think and make it happen, visualize it and make it happen. It goes against our grain to say, wait a second, maybe our thoughts actually aren't that meaningful. Maybe they're just a running commentary. Maybe it's a random thought that I'm having about lunch, and it's not to be imbued with this type of meaning that gives it power, because the research really is starting to show us that it's not negative thoughts that cause depression or anxiety. It's negative thoughts taking on the quality of being sticky that causes anxiety and depression. And that's where this self-distancing comes in, being able to learn to separate from your thoughts, being able to defuse yourself from your thoughts. We call that cognitive defusion, being able to be an observer of your thoughts. Of course, this goes back, centuries in mindfulness teachings, in meditation teachings, being able to learn to be an observer of your thoughts. And so I was grateful too that these worlds are all coming together. This deep and rich Eastern history of meditation and mindfulness, combined with new psychological data that shows just how helpful it can be. And so often a first step of really taking this self away from your thoughts and taking this distance, creating this distance, is to label your thoughts as an outsider, right? To narrate them. So instead of, oh, this day is going to be a disaster, or, I'm not up for this, you say, I'm having the thought that this day is going to be a disaster. I'm having the thought that I'm not up for this. Some people will do this in the third person, which can sound super hokey, but the hokiness is actually part of the beauty of it, because you're reminding yourself that this is just a thought, that you're separating yourself. Andrea thinks that she's going to be a disaster in this talk today, or Andrea thinks that her life's never going to get back to normal after all these disruptions. Being able to narrate your thoughts as an observer who's gentle with yourself removes you from the equation. You're no longer over-identifying with your thoughts. And it's then that we can start to use the tools to let the thoughts pass rather than to keep them sticking. So that is the heart and soul of the book, is from that fundamental premise, which really appears within the first few pages, being able to then build on that and be able to catch yourself from having these thoughts stick. And there are lots and lots of fun little tools for that. I mean, no clients are the same, just like no two readers are the same. And so one thing that I've loved doing is being able to throw so many different techniques into this book to say, here's how this one worked for this person. Here's how this one worked for this person. But I do want to talk a little bit more about sort of the cognitive traps that we get into, because I think that is really part of what's entering the conversation now, is that we all are looking through distorted lenses in certain ways. None of us is completely objective. None of our thoughts are completely objective. And so we all have blind spots. And of course, one very important blind spot for a lot of us is implicit bias, as I mentioned, that we absorb within our culture ways of looking at race and ethnicity, ways of making snap judgments that are almost built into us once we start absorbing it. And we all have an incredible amount of blind spots. And the point is not to throw our hands up in the air and say, well, we're all biased anyway, there's nothing to be able to do with it, to be done about it. The point is to shine a light on it. And again, to view this lens as something that we actually can separate ourselves from. And so some of the additional cognitive traps that are so powerful that I've seen are things like all or none thinking. That is so prevalent in people who come to my therapy office. I cannot tell you just how common it is, whether somebody is suffering from depression or anxiety or substance abuse or relationship problems or bulimia or whatever it might be. All or none thinking is an incredibly common cognitive trap that we fall into. There are also ones that are based in sort of the negativity bias. All of us actually tend to be biased towards negative information at the expense of positive information. And this is one of those biases that's actually, it's an evolutionary adaptation. It made sense when we were trying to fight for our survival that to be hyper attuned to threat is actually a positive thing, because it's the threat that we need to pay attention to if we want to not get eaten, right? Nowadays, of course, this manifests, you get a performance review at work and there's one negative comment from your boss, and that's what sticks with you. Never mind, 90% of the stuff said was good. It's that one negative comment that sticks with you. Now, I'll tell you the scary thing about negativity bias is it makes us more fearful too. And what's frightening about the fear is that it's increasing because of sleep deprivation. At least this is my personal belief. We could spend a whole talk just on sleep, and I'm the biggest hypocrite in the world about this. Let's face it. And I've gone completely, nocturnal. But sleep deprivation makes us more negative. We know this. We get irritable. We're more grouchy. All of us know this. But few of us actually know that this is evolutionary. This is actually a change that happens in our brains. We perceive threat more intensely when we're sleep deprived. And again, this was because back in the day, it helped keep us from getting eaten. When we were sluggish and sleep deprived, we were more in danger. We weren't as quick. We were likely to fall asleep, right? So our brains adapted and said, okay, well, we're just going to err on the side of viewing everything as a threat. That'll help keep us alive. And this has persisted. And again, this is backed up by empirical validation. We've measured this. We can look at judgments. You can give somebody neutral stimuli and ask them how threatening it is. And if they're more sleep deprived, they're actually going to view things as more threatening. So in this day and age, unfortunately, we're not getting enough sleep. A lot of it is our schedules. We're busier than ever. The smartphones, we know that the blue light, that frequency actually disrupts our sleep. Our cortisol levels don't diminish as much. So unfortunately, our brains are perceiving threat. We're more anxious. And of course, the numbers back this up. Anxiety disorders are on the rise. And it's not only about sleep, of course, but I always like to get that little bit in. If something sticks with you today, it's hopefully the fact that even just 15 minutes earlier of a bedtime for you can actually make a difference truly in your mood and your perception of things. And there have been people who actually feel that the fear-based sort of political climate that we've seen over the past few years, where certain politicians home in really on this idea of fear, and they take that and they run with it, be afraid of everyone else, that part of that is being made worse by the fact that we're a more sleep deprived society. But that actually comes into part of the book that I really loved getting into, which is the bodily response, right? We tend to think of our thoughts as thoughts and our emotions as emotions, and then our body as our body. The truth is it's all connected. And I'm seeing so much now about the ways that sleep deprivation, but also physical anxiety just manifests itself. It's all a cycle. And so part of what my favorite, or one of my favorite chapters in the book does, is gets you to recognize the ways in which your physical body are contributing to your anxious thoughts and how cyclical that can be. And how if you can stop that, if you can break that pattern, how much calmer you can actually be. Because I work with a lot of clients where it's just almost impossible in the beginning to tease out, okay, they're anxious, but they don't even know how their body is contributing to that anxiety. And where's the chicken and where's the egg of what the anxiety says. So to keep in mind this idea of the fact that our bodies and our minds, there's really no delineation clearly between that. I mean, we're just scratching the surface. There's new research about inflammation and how it can increase depression, or gut bacteria and how that can play a role in mental illness more generally. And so I'm really excited to share that part too, what we know in the data about the ways that our physical selves can actually influence, for better and for worse, the way that we think and the way that we feel. But as I sort of close down here, I wanted to read just a brief section of the book. And I wanted to read this section today because I want to talk a little bit about forgiveness. And there's a whole chapter on the book about gratitude and forgiveness and how we know these are good for us, but we tend to get them wrong as concepts. And part of what I'm seeing right now is folks reckoning with, for instance, thinking about implicit bias and systemic injustice, and thinking about the ways that they have maybe contributed to that unknowingly. And what do we do with that? How do we move forward and have been, how do we not have shame about it that's going to get in our way, but how do we turn our own sort of misdeeds or our own ignorance into change? How do we actually look at that? So I'm going to read you a brief little section thinking about one of my clients. Again, everything is very, very blurred here in terms of confidential details, but thinking about someone named Julianne who struggled mightily with self-blame and guilt, and had a hard time forgiving herself after her sister's death. So this is when beating yourself up feels less scary than the alternative. Blaming yourself may be far easier and come more naturally than facing your fears. Take 31-year-old Julianne. Julianne's twin sister, Rebecca, a creative, vibrant, and loving person, lived out a tragic struggle with opioid addiction. Rebecca spiraled downward for years before dying of a heroin overdose the day after Julianne had confronted her about getting help, and Rebecca had denied that she needed it. Julianne was despondent with guilt and blamed herself. This hijacked her thoughts and mood virtually every day, adding to the devastating grief she was already dealing with. Not only could Julianne not forgive herself for Rebecca's death, she would not have even identified self-forgiveness as a goal. She did not believe that she deserved it. Though Julianne had tried for years to get help for Rebecca, she felt certain she hadn't done enough. In her mind, there was always one more thing she could have done, especially in the weeks leading up to Rebecca's death. She should have forced Rebecca to stay overnight with her, even if the confrontation got physical. She should have found Rebecca's dealer and threatened to call the police. She should have confiscated Rebecca's cell phone. She should have taken a leave of absence from her job to be with Rebecca nonstop. She should have hired someone to strong-arm Rebecca into another attempt at rehab. She should have offered Rebecca a bribe, any bribe, Julianne's life savings if necessary, to force her to go to inpatient rehab. Of course, Julianne also felt certain that her actual confrontation with Rebecca is what killed her, and that she should have just stayed quiet in that particular moment. So she beat herself up from both sides. The list of shoulds went on. Of course, this list defied logic. Even if Rebecca had stayed with Julianne as she had in the past, she could have sought heroin while Julianne was sleeping, as she had in the past. Should Julianne have never slept? Rebecca had multiple dealers and multiple friends who would pick her up and supply drugs. There was no way at that point to cut them off unless Rebecca chose to. Rebecca had also occasionally disappeared or gotten physically aggressive with Julianne when she tried to set limits. What if Julianne herself got hurt? How would she have kept Rebecca safe then? What if Julianne had depleted her life savings and Rebecca still did not get clean? And what evidence was there that doing nothing instead of the confrontation that day would have ended Rebecca's addiction and kept her alive? Addiction, not a confrontation, killed Rebecca. Of course, the shoulds weren't rational. But something else far more important began to emerge as we worked together. Julianne had a strong, unconscious motive to keep blaming herself. By telling herself that she caused Rebecca's death, Julianne kept some control. The world could still be a fair and just place. Julianne simply hadn't done what she was supposed to. In this version, had Julianne followed a concrete series of steps, then Rebecca would still be alive. The universe could still make sense. Unfortunately, life is more unpredictable and potentially frightening than that. And that was what Julianne was choosing to avoid thinking about. Blaming herself was actually more comfortable. Julianne and her husband had been starting to talk about having children, and the root of her negative self-talk became clear. If Julianne believed that she could have stopped Rebecca from dying, then she could also believe she'd be able to keep her future children safe from harm as well. By holding on to her blame, Julianne protected herself against something far darker, the terrifying reality that addiction is brutal, ugly, and unfair, and can kill someone you've loved since the day they were born. That you can try to get someone help, but when they refuse it, you can't control their behavior, even when you desperately want to save them. That loving someone opens you up to a staggering amount of emotional risk, and choosing to be a parent makes this risk chronic and unrelenting. This reality, especially given Julianne's grief, was absolutely paralyzing. It was far easier to imagine that she could have saved Rebecca, that it was Julianne's own mistakes that led to her death. Because at least in that world, Julianne could avoid making the same mistakes with her own children someday. This dynamic is not nearly as uncommon as you'd think, And it doesn't show up only with self-blame. We also tend to more harshly blame others because of our desire to see the world as predictable, fair, and orderly. It feels easier and more comfortable to believe that someone deserved the awful thing that happened to them, rather than understanding that sometimes awful things happen and they can happen to us too. Awful things can strike like lightning out of the blue, even when we followed the rules, and this can terrify us. How much more convenient and comforting to assume that people who fall victim to terrible things must have had it coming. By believing that life is predictable and that terrible things happen only to people who have done something wrong, we don't have to face the far scarier truth. Sometimes life brings unexpected pain, even to people who have done everything right and don't deserve it at all. Blame, though, blocks out the chance for connection. And acknowledging our deepest fears is what lets in the light. In Julianne's case, once we uncovered the fears underneath the blame, we could finally start addressing them. Not only could we find better ways for her to manage those fears going forward and healthy ways to cope with the unpredictable scariness of life and parenting, but we could also finally help Julianne see the truth, that she was not responsible for Rebecca's death. And she could begin to truly reckon with the full tragedy of the loss and stop hiding from it by making it about her own mistakes. Only then could Julianne start to grieve Rebecca in a pure, whole, genuine way, not a contorted one full of layers of anger at herself. It took time and was scary at first, but Julianne was finally able to let go of the blame and rumination. She could label those fears and anxious thoughts as what they truly were and understand that they didn't represent truth and that she didn't have to run from them anymore. She could finally, with work and insight, give herself permission to set down the self-punishment to free herself from carrying it any longer. She could forgive herself. And next in the book, I talk about the fact that you might be hearing that story and thinking, okay, yeah, well, Julianne wasn't responsible for Rebecca's death. What about when I have actually harmed someone? How do I actually go about finding forgiveness then? And what we talk about in that case is the fact that at some point, continuing to blame yourself and continuing to beat up on yourself walls you off from other people, and it actually prevents you from atoning for your mistakes. It prevents you from moving forward and thinking about ways to reconnect because you're inside your own head. And if you think that atoning is merely about beating yourself up, rather than actually finding a way to move forward in the world and reconnect with others and apologize or do good works for other people, that's not right. Beating yourself up just adds more darkness to the universe. And I'll end on this note of ahimsa, which I talk about in the book, and which actually was introduced to me by another therapist at a very difficult time in my life. And it's the idea, it goes back, it's been the basis of many Eastern philosophies. It goes back to this idea of connection, how we are all connected, and how a kindness towards another person or an injustice towards another person is also an unkindness. An evil or aggressive act or an injustice towards another person is also an injustice towards ourselves. It's an unkindness towards ourselves. And the reverse is true as well for people that struggle so much with self-blame and with beating themselves up and with being aggressively cruel to themselves. They are actually adding cruelty to the universe as well. And this is something as a concept that I've been thinking so much about lately as we struggle as a nation with our own collective systemic toxins, as you will. I think it's so important that those of us who are committed to the cause of anti-racism and the cause of examining our own behavior and teaching our children differently, it's so important that we don't get bogged down in shame and regret. And it's important that we do extend forgiveness to ourselves for mistakes that we have made and ignorance that we have had, because our way of moving forward is to not get bogged down in our own shame. Our way of moving forward is to shine a light on our own responsibility. So I love this idea of ahimsa. And actually a lot of civil rights leaders, including Martin Luther King, used it in the 60s, this idea of us all being part of a connected universe where injustice in one place is injustice for all of us. And so I would encourage that thinking moving forward, that it's not about getting bogged down with shame. It's about actually owning our mistakes and being willing to grow from them, and thinking about how discomfort, it doesn't just have to be negative, how discomfort, once again, can tell us that something needs fixing, that something needs change, that something needs growth. So again, it's definitely a special time for me to be here, and I so appreciate this discussion. And now I look forward to your questions.
Dr. Andrea, thank you so much. That was really, really wonderful. Just like your style in the book, your message is so accessible, and you have such a way of phrasing things that just like really makes things click in. So thank you for sharing all of that with us. When I heard you telling the story, I heard a lot of those sticky words that came up, and I know should is one of those big sticky words. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about some of those the sticky words that we get in our mind that are tough to disengage from.
Yes. And it's so interesting because I think a lot of us don't have the opportunity to really listen to ourselves speak and notice these types of sort of verbal quirks that we have. And we might think, oh, that's just a verbal quirk, or that's just the way we speak. But in reality, a lot of times the way we speak is also the way we talk to ourselves in our own head. And as kind of an aside, when I was first in training in my clinical doctoral program, basically all my sessions had to be recorded. And of course, the consent was given from the client, and some were video, some were audio. And then talk about another uncomfortable experience to learn from. I was sort of forced to reckon with all the ways that I had these words that I used over and over again. Oh, I can't believe I say sort of so much, or I can't believe I use the word actually 4 times. And I was forced to look at that, but it was very interesting because it also made me think about the way that I think and the way that I speak to myself internally. So part of what the book talks about are these common ways of talking to ourselves that once they start to stick, they really do affect our thinking. And all or none thinking is one example of that. As I mentioned, it's so common, but those words about should, the word about, what that expectation actually means. I should do this. And so the book talks about where that yardstick comes from. A lot of us are carrying around this should yardstick of unrealistic expectations. Maybe it's our parents' voices of making us feel like we never quite measured up. Maybe it's certain cultural values that we've picked up and turned on ourselves in a negative way. Cannot do, I cannot is another one. Oh, I can't do this. I always, and I've been getting on my kids for this lately with the all or none thinking, I always do this, or you always do this, or this is never going to work out, or something is ruined. When we listen to actually the way we talk about things, this is all or none thinking in particular, something being ruined. A lot of times we use that word in a way that's very sort of a false dichotomy, right? We're actually catastrophizing. We're actually making ourselves more helpless. We're actually refusing to see that there is a path forward. Instead, we're sort of becoming hopeless. This is ruined. But I think the should yardstick is so interesting. And there's another chapter devoted on comparing ourselves to others, because we tend to do this even more now than ever. And honestly, it's very fashionable to blame social media for a lot of things, but the data really does strikingly talk about how for a lot of people, the comparison aspect of social media can be very, very toxic. And people start to really develop this yardstick of what they should be doing and what they should look like and what their house should look like and how their kids should be achieving things. And when you really think about it, it's such a false narrative. It's such a harmful narrative, because what it does is it blocks out our own autonomy. It makes us feel like we're supposed to be on someone else's path. We're supposed to be having a nicer vacation than this person, or we're supposed to have calmer kids than this person. And those shoulds become so negative. So I would encourage everybody to really just listen to the language, the voice that you use. Once again, as a curious and non-judgmental observer, but as somebody who recognizes, hey, maybe that doesn't represent reality. When I talk with body image to my students and we talk about eating disorders, I always start that discussion with the fact that, if any of us use the same voice to talk about our friends' bodies that we often use to talk about our own, our friends would be
not be our friend.
Right? But we just accept it. I think especially for women, they've had a narrative since adolescence. Oh, I don't look good in this. But if you just take a step back and again, you label that should of I should fit into this size, or I should look like this airbrushed photo, only then can you shine a light on it. And then you can start disempowering that thought. So yeah, there's a lot of thinking to be done about the yardsticks that we choose to let into our lives. And of course, we all have goals and we all have comparisons that we make with others, but we need to be very mindful that whatever yardsticks we are letting into our lives, that they actually deserve to be there because they affect us greatly.
Right. So it sounds a little bit like you're saying identify where the should sort of comes from. Who's giving you that idea of should? Is it social media? Is it the voice of your mother from 20 years ago in your head? Is that what you're saying? So how do we both identify that the thought is not serving us and then de-escalate?
Yeah, the identification is that first crucial step, because when we label it, then we can start to externalize it. It doesn't have to be actually part of it. And so one of the examples in the case studies of the book is literally she created a visual of a yardstick. I mean, again, this sounds hokey. You'd be amazed at how well it works with continued practice. Every time she looked in the mirror and thought, oh, I don't like my skin, she visualized this yardstick and she visualized torching the yardstick. Sometimes she used a little bit more colorful language than torching the yardstick, but it was just a mental pause. It was a mental pause, and it was enough to get her to detach from that voice. But it's so interesting because labeling that thought and stepping aside from it really is the first step. And we can't skip that step at all. And the same is true for emotions. There's power in labeling your emotion. The data really backs this up by saying, I feel scared, I feel sad. We actually have the first step in healing because it feels more manageable that way.
Well, that sort of ties into a question that we had from Ferenc, who wanted to know what your technique is for unsticking daily negative thoughts that cause anxiety, but more connected to what you just said, meaning thoughts that have been in your mind for a while. So you think them subconsciously. So I think the distinction there, at least from what I'm assuming he meant, is it's one thing to sort of hear the shoulds and hear those sticky words that you're using in your head, but what if you don't hear them? What if you don't know what your thoughts are? What if you just are feeling like stressed or anxious and you don't know how you got there?
Yeah. And that's true for a lot of people. And so sometimes the first step is even more preliminary. And, for some people, meditation is a great way to start this. And I think a lot of us hear meditation and think, that's too much for me.
It's too much.
Yeah. Now she's telling me to light some candle and devote an hour of my, and it's not that. I mean, when we talk about mindfulness, we could be talking about simply 5 minutes of sitting and just noticing what's going on with my body, what's going on with my thoughts. Maybe I'm not sure that I'm having these thoughts, but maybe besides the meditation, I can start to look for patterns. So I would recommend for Frank, for instance, if some of these things are unconscious, they're probably still manifesting in patterns. So what I do with a lot of my clients when they're like, okay, well, I don't know, I'm just, I'm depressed this week and I can't figure out what's going on. It's like, okay, well, let's look at some of the factors. We're going to be scientists here. Maybe we're going to have you chart, your interactions, your mood. Might it be about some things that we've already established are your vulnerabilities? Because then you can look for patterns, and only then can you start to play detective and uncover, okay, this did happen, 4 afternoons in a row after I got kind of lonely and frustrated at work. And maybe what's really going on there is that I'm having some thoughts of how I actually don't have enough friends, or how I'm stuck in a dead end job and I wish I had more autonomy. So a lot of times if they're unconscious and you don't actually hear them, it's a matter of, step one, trying to give them room and space to come out by maybe trying some sort of basic laying down, noticing your breathing and watching your thoughts go by. But if that doesn't work, it really is helpful to look for the bigger patterns, because sometimes you can see it in your behavior. I worked with a guy once who was like, I don't know, I don't know what's going through my head. I just scream at my wife. I just do. Right. It's like, okay, well, let's break that down. And the next time you're about to scream at her, we're going to first step, have you literally pause and actually notice, because something's going on there. It's not nothing. It's making you scream at her. So we're going to have a week of practicing the pause. And then from there, we can get some data to work with.
Interesting. It's really helpful to think about how to find the thoughts if you don't know the ones that are triggering you. I'm just glancing at my notes because we have some questions here, but I also have some that I wanted to make sure we get to. You mentioned as an example of the person who was yelling, who was maybe perhaps having unidentified thoughts about feeling lonely at work or not good enough at their job. Loneliness triggered me because I know in this current moment, so many of us are feeling that way. And your book has some really excellent tips and techniques for combating loneliness. However, they're sort of difficult to practice right now. Could you talk about how to sort of adjust your recommendations to deepen connections in the pandemic during this time?
Yeah, that's been so striking because I've spent a long time in my career focused on relationships. An earlier book I wrote was on relationships. And I'm such a big believer in the fact that nobody talks about how relationships are one of the actual key predictors of physical health. People think, oh, yeah, I feel better when I have relationships. But actually, all the research on immune systems and longevity, it's really striking. Like, loneliness is a public health issue. It really does shorten your lifespan, and we have a chronic problem with loneliness that seems to be getting worse. So unfortunately, for years it was very easy for me to say, here are some steps to build community and here are some ways. And then the pandemic hits, and what's so different about this particular crisis in American culture is that all the usual coping techniques of connecting with other people, a lot of them we couldn't do. I mean, what do we usually do in times of crisis? We go to our neighbors, we bring meals to each other, we gather. And the double whammy of this particular crisis in terms of the pandemic is that we couldn't do that. And so people who already were a little bit lonely, it really increased. And so part of what I recommend now, and so, for some of us, depending on where we live, things are getting to the point where we can reach out a little bit more and certain restrictions are loosening a little bit. But part of what I recommend now is really to observe yourself in terms of your particular patterns of what actually makes you feel most fulfilled. So people are lonely, quote unquote, in different ways. Some people are lonely, they're around other people all the time, but the feeling of loneliness is that they're not actually being their authentic selves. They're not actually showing true vulnerability and being able to show who they really are. Other people are lonely because they literally moved to a new town and they don't know anybody and they feel like they don't have friends as an adult, and they're really ashamed of that or scared of that. And so for those people, the answer is really to think about, the basic steps. It's a numbers game of reaching out to organizations that you might want to volunteer with, or joining your neighborhood listserv, or doing some volunteer work, or thinking about activities. So no two people are lonely in a different way. But I think right now in this pandemic, it really is about observing in what particular ways you're lonely and trying to target where you would meet like-minded people and nudge yourself a little bit to actually open yourself up to a connection. Because for some of us, we're scared to do that, right? We don't want to be rejected. But I always tell people, you didn't expect to marry the first person that you went on a date with. So don't expect every friendship to stick either. It's not a reflection on you, but it's a loaded thing. The idea of not having friends, it makes us think of the third grade lunchroom and how no one would sit with us. So it's tough.
So once we've identified the thoughts and your techniques for making connections are important, an important stepping off point, maybe, what else do you recommend as a way to move from the anxiousness and into that fulfilling life that you referenced? So are there specific tips you could unpack for us in our last 10 minutes?
Yeah, sure. Sure. One thing we didn't talk about that's so crucial in that process is the idea of identifying your values. So, in
Mhm.
fact, I just, have been talking about this a lot with clients who feel sort of stressed and confused. Where do we go from here? I'm upset. I'm anxious. I know I need to change, but I don't know how to do it. And so, part of what we can do with anxiety and actually turn it into something that has impact and that makes us feel like we're moving forward is to figure out where it can help us with a sense of meaning, because I think this is another crucial point, and I get into it in the book quite a bit. A lot of us think that happiness means joy and pleasure, right? That's what happiness is. It's the, we should feel good, right?
So we,
And
we even have a yardstick for how feeling well should look. Is that
yes,
right? We
yes,
have an expectation. Yeah.
exactly. We
Mhm.
should be happy in this particular way, and we should be, and our kids should be happy. Our kids aren't happy enough. What's going on? The truth is, a lot of the research really points to the fact that that's an oversimplified version of happiness. And it's also an oversimplified version of being anxiety free, too. What
Hmm.
true engagement with life actually looks like in a fulfilling way, the most fulfilled people, the ones who truly have the deepest version of what we consider happiness that actually is lasting, are the ones who have found a sense of meaning and a
Hmm.
sense of purpose. And that's not the same thing as being joyful all the time. And so I think for people struggling with anxiety, part of what we can do is we can figure out how to identify this deeper sense of purpose, this deeper sense of values. What do I want each day to look like in the bigger picture? Maybe I value creativity, or I value my relationships and the people I love, or I value autonomy, or I value adventure, or I value learning. No two people have the same values. And when you can start to think about living in accordance with your values, then when your anxious voice starts to spiral out of control and you're stepping away from, you try to step away from it in order to actually disempower it, but you can say, okay, what is my value right now? And this is a component of acceptance and commitment therapy. And if this is hurting this, then it's going to give me further motivation to use some of the techniques like that are in the book. Maybe it's a visualization of watching your anxious thought pass. Maybe it's a
Mhm.
meditation of feeling that anxiety leave your body. Maybe it's writing down the thought in a certain way and doing something very symbolic with it. Maybe it's thinking about the thought as a metaphor. It's, some dirt on a stream, but I'm going to watch the dirt pass because my value here is moving towards change, or my value is compassion for my community. My
Mhm.
value is helping others. And
Mhm.
this is really just a heckler, right? This is a heckler. I'm on this
Getting in
marathon,
there.
running this marathon toward my values. And this is some dude on the sidelines screaming at me negative things. I can
Hmm.
actually run past this anxious thought now because I know that I've got my eye on the prize of my values.
That's such an interesting connection between, I think, the way maybe we traditionally look at self-help,
Mm-hmm.
and the way that when we do work on ourselves, we are able to enact change and be a part of our communities in helpful ways, which is especially important in this moment we're in now. Um, so I think that ties in with this question that we have from Miriam, who says she's so glad that you're talking about anti racism and wants to know how we can use the techniques in the book to rid ourselves of racist thought patterns as well as patterns of shame over contributing to racism.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the first thought is about those blind spots. So it's really about examining, and it's really about recognizing that I have a distorted lens here. So instead of just assuming that my lens is normal, challenging myself each time to say, wait a second, is this truth? Or is this actually the lens that I'm looking through? And maybe this lens is something that I've carried for 20 years, but I make this judgment about people. Or I've never actually imagined the fact that, maybe I had privilege in this circumstance. Because all of us, again, have these lenses. And I think it's detaching from that lens that makes us able to disempower that lens, because we're viewing that lens now as distorted and unreliable. So it's literally shining that light in the blind spot. And part of that is by reading. I know I know you all at Politics and Prose have been overwhelmed with orders for books on really fighting racism and becoming an anti-racist person rather than just this idea of non-racist. And I think that's been so wonderful because it really is about educating ourselves. In terms of the shame, it's about, maybe taking a moment in your day and sort of having a visual. How do I want to move forward here? Yes, I've made mistakes. Yes, I haven't been informed in the past, but how can I visualize that actually moving into growth? What's it going to take for me to turn that into growth? I can either wallow in the mistakes that I've made, or I can do more good for the universe by moving forward and turning that into growth. Because by being vulnerable and actually admitting that, yes, I have implicit bias. Yes, I've been part of a system that has given me benefit that is not afforded to certain other people. By acknowledging that, that's how we can change it, rather than saying, "Oh, I don't want to talk about this. It's too difficult because I'm guilty and that makes me uncomfortable."
Mm-hmm. It's so important. I think everything in this book, it just really provides a roadmap for growth. And it's so important to think about now how we can impact change and affect change from working on ourselves and then looking outward.
Thank you.
So thank you so much for joining us today. I feel like I could have a whole other hour with you. I have so many more questions. And we didn't get to all of the audience questions. So what I was hoping is if we could get you to put together a little email to send out to everyone who joined us today, because we didn't get to all of the questions. So we have a few more. And if you're open to that, everyone should look for an email.
Yes, I would love to do that. I would love to do that. And that's so helpful for me too, because part of me, I'm seeing the chat now and I'm seeing these incredibly kind comments and some additional questions. And I'm thinking, I wish I could do two things at once and actually address both.
Oh, well,
so
please.
Great.
Yes, we'll be in touch. And everyone who joined us today, check your the email address that you used to sign up for this talk, and you will have something special from us soon. So thanks everyone. And speaking of soon, if you enjoy events like this, this Live at Lunch series is hosted by me every Wednesday. And these are events that are uniquely designed to help you thrive and find meaning. And next Wednesday, I'm talking to Meredith Feynman, who is an entrepreneur, writer, and podcast host. And she's a leadership and development expert that elevates individuals. She's going to teach us how to brag better. So be prepared. I'm going to come on and just talk about myself for an hour. Thank you, everyone. And also in this email we'll make sure you get a link to this presentation so that you can share it with your friends or rewatch again.
Thank you.
So, thank you, Dr. Andrea. Have a great afternoon and stay well, everyone, and stay well read.
Thank you so much.